"May I have this dance, princess?" Those 6 words, spoken by a man in Janitor's coveralls to a wheelchair-bound girl in a crystal ballroom, would shatter every assumption about worth, dignity, and what it means to be truly wealthy. What happened next would change 3 lives forever, and leave a billionaire tech mogul questioning everything he thought he knew about success. But let me take you back to where it all began, in the glittering halls of the Emerald Crown Resort, where society's elite had gathered for what was supposed to be just another night of champagne and networking. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Aurora Grand Ballroom at Emerald Crown Resort buzzed with the quiet confidence that only comes with extraordinary wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across marble floors, so polished they reflected like mirrors. Women draped in silk and diamonds glided between tables laden with delicacies most people couldn't pronounce, while men in custom-tailored tuxedos discussed mergers and acquisitions as casually as others might chat about the weather. This was the annual Pinnacle Foundation Gala, where Seattle's most influential gathered to write 7-figure checks for charity while cementing business deals worth hundreds of millions. Tech moguls rubbed shoulders with oil executives, pharmaceutical heiresses clinked glasses with real estate dynasties, and startup founders desperate for funding circled venture capitalists like moths to flame. At table 7, near the orchestra but not quite close enough to the stage to seem eager, sat Rebecca Hartwell. At 42, she had built Hartwell Industries from a garage startup into a renewable energy empire worth $12 billion. Her auburn hair was pulled into an elegant chignon, her emerald dress chosen specifically to complement her company's brand colors. Everything about Rebecca was calculated, precise, controlled. Everything except her 9-year-old daughter. Emma Hartwell sat beside her mother in a custom-made wheelchair that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her legs, thin and motionless beneath a flowing lavender dress, bore the evidence of spina bifida, a condition that had shaped her young life but never dimmed the fierce intelligence burning in her dark eyes. While other children her age might have been intimidated by such grandeur, Emma surveyed the ballroom with the curiosity of a scientist studying an interesting specimen. "Mom, why does everyone here talk so loudly about helping people but whisper when they talk about money?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the unfiltered honesty that made adults uncomfortable. Rebecca's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her wine glass. "Emma, please keep your voice down. This is important for Mommy's business." But Emma wasn't listening to her mother anymore. Her attention had been captured by movement at the far edge of the ballroom, where the servants' entrance led to the kitchen corridors. A man in navy blue coveralls was wheeling a large trash bin through the shadows, moving with the practiced invisibility that comes with years of being overlooked. His name was Daniel Rodriguez, though none of the gala attendees would have bothered to learn it. At 38, Daniel carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to find pride in honest work, even when that work was cleaning up after people who wouldn't acknowledge his existence. His weathered hand spoke of countless 12-hour shifts, his graying temples of sleepless nights spent juggling 2 jobs to support his daughter. Yes, Daniel had a daughter too. 7-year-old Lily, who was spending the evening with Mrs. Chen next door. Probably asleep on the couch by now with her favorite stuffed elephant clutched tight. Lily, who had never known her mother. Lily, who thought her daddy was the strongest, smartest, most wonderful man in the world, even though he came home every night smelling of industrial cleaner and floor wax. Daniel had been working at Emerald Crown for 3 years, arriving before dawn to prepare for events like this, staying long after midnight to restore the ballroom to its pristine state. He had perfected the art of moving through these glittering gatherings like a ghost, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces while remaining completely invisible to the people whose discarded champagne flutes and half-eaten canapes he cleared away. Tonight should have been no different. Replace the liner in the corner receptacle, wipe down the marble column bases, check that the service hallway remained clear for the catering staff. Simple, routine, invisible. But tonight, someone was watching him. Emma had been observing Daniel for the past 20 minutes, fascinated by his methodical movements and the gentle way he handled even the mundane task of waste removal. There was something in his careful attention to detail, something in the way he straightened his shoulders despite the humble nature of his work, that reminded her of her favorite teacher back at her private school. Mr. Peterson always said that dignity wasn't about what job you did, but about how you did it. "That man works very hard," Emma murmured, more to herself than to her mother. Rebecca followed her daughter's gaze and frowned. "Emma, it's not polite to stare at the help." "The help?" Emma's voice carried a note of confusion. "You mean he helps people, like we're supposed to be doing tonight?" Before Rebecca could respond, the evening's entertainment began. A string quartet positioned themselves near the dance floor, and the master of ceremonies announced that the traditional charity auction would be followed by dancing. Several couples were already moving toward the parquet floor, preparing for the kind of choreographed social dancing that served as much to display wealth and status as any genuine enjoyment of music. Emma watched the elegant couples take their positions, her dark eyes reflecting not envy but something deeper, a longing that had nothing to do with walking and everything to do with being seen, being included, being treated as more than an object of pity or inspiration. And across the ballroom, Daniel Rodriguez paused in his work, drawn by the same music that had captured Emma's attention. For just a moment, his professional invisibility slipped and something vulnerable flickered across his features, the expression of a man remembering what it felt like to hold someone close, to move to music, to be part of something beautiful instead of just cleaning up after it. Neither Emma nor Daniel knew it yet, but they were about to collide in a moment that would expose every assumption, challenge every boundary, and prove that sometimes the most profound acts of courage come from the most unexpected places. The music swelled, couples began to dance, and destiny held its breath. Kai Vri. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The string quartet's melody floated through the Aurora Grand Ballroom like silk ribbons on evening air. Violins sang in perfect harmony, while the cello provided a rich foundation that seemed to make the crystal chandeliers shimmer in response. It was Pachelbel's canon in D. Safe, classical, the kind of music that wealthy donors expected at charity galas. But for Emma Hartwell, sitting in her wheelchair at the edge of the dance floor, the music was magic. Her small hands moved unconsciously in her lap, fingers conducting an invisible orchestra as she watched couple after couple glide across the polished marble. There was something hypnotic about the way the dancers moved together, their steps synchronized, their bodies telling a story without words. Emma had never danced, never could dance in the traditional sense, but she felt the rhythm deep in her bones, the way some people feel poetry or see colors in music. "Look how beautiful they look together," she whispered to her mother, her voice filled with wonder rather than sadness. Rebecca barely glanced up from her phone, where she was reviewing quarterly reports that couldn't wait until Monday. Very nice, sweetheart." But Emma wasn't looking at her mother anymore. Her attention had been captured by someone moving at the periphery of her vision. Daniel Rodriguez had finished emptying the waste receptacles and was now wiping down the marble columns that supported the ballroom's soaring ceiling. But he wasn't just cleaning, he was moving to the music. It was subtle, a gentle sway of his shoulders, a slight shift in his step that matched the quartet's tempo. His weathered hands moved the cloth in time with the melody, transforming mundane maintenance into something that looked almost like choreography. For a man who spent his days invisible to the glittering crowd around him, Daniel moved with surprising grace, as if the music had awakened something dormant in his soul. Emma watched, fascinated. Here was someone who felt the same magic she did, someone who understood that music was more than just background noise for networking and small talk. And unlike everyone else in the ballroom, he was alone, no partner to share the rhythm with, no one to appreciate the way he transformed work into art. The song was building to its crescendo when Emma made a decision that would alter 3 lives forever. She pressed the button on her wheelchair's control panel, and the motorized chair began to move. Not toward her mother, not toward the ladies' lounge, but directly across the dance floor toward the man in navy coveralls who was lost in his own world of music and motion. The wheelchair's quiet hum was barely audible over the string quartet, but in the refined atmosphere of the Aurora Grand Ballroom, Emma's movement created ripples of attention. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. The kind of people who were accustomed to having their every action scrutinized by society photographers suddenly found themselves watching a 9-year-old girl navigate her wheelchair through dancing couples with the determination of a ship cutting through waves. Rebecca looked up from her phone just in time to see her daughter disappearing into the crowd. "Emma? Emma? Where are you?" But her words were lost as the music swelled and her daughter continued her purposeful journey across the ballroom. Daniel didn't notice the approaching wheelchair at first. He was lost in memories of dancing with his late wife Maria in their tiny apartment kitchen, both of them laughing as they spun to salsa music playing from a scratchy radio, of swaying with baby Lily in his arms during those endless colicky nights, humming lullabies until she finally fell asleep. Music had always been his escape, his connection to something larger than the daily grind of survival. "Excuse me, sir." The small voice cut through his reverie like a gentle bell. Daniel turned, expecting to see one of the gala organizers asking him to move his cleaning cart or perhaps work more quietly. Instead, he found himself looking down into the most serious pair of dark eyes he had ever encountered. Emma sat in her wheelchair directly in front of him, her lavender dress spread carefully around her still legs, her small hands folded in her lap with the poise of someone much older. She looked up at him with an expression that held no pity, no condescension, no awkwardness, just genuine human curiosity and something that might have been recognition. "I've been watching you," she said simply. "You love music, don't you?" Daniel blinked, caught completely off guard. In 3 years of working these events, no guest had ever spoken to him directly, let alone asked him a personal question. He glanced around quickly, expecting to see security moving toward them, or some parent rushing to retrieve their child from an inappropriate interaction with the help. Yes, miss, I do." His voice was quiet, uncertain, "but I should probably—" "My name is Emma," she interrupted gently. "What's yours?" The simple question hit Daniel like a physical blow. When was the last time someone at one of these events had asked his name? When was the last time anyone in this world of wealth and privilege had treated him like a human being rather than a piece of furniture that happened to move? "Daniel," he managed. "Daniel Rodriguez." Emma smiled, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen all evening in a room full of practiced social expressions. "It's nice to meet you properly, Daniel. I have a question for you." By now, they had definitely attracted attention. The string quartet played on, but conversations had died away in ever-widening circles around this unlikely pair. Cell phones appeared as if by magic, their cameras trained on the scene unfolding in the center of the dance floor. Rebecca Hartwell had risen from her chair and was pushing through the crowd, her face a mask of mortification and panic. But Emma seemed oblivious to the attention. Her focus remained entirely on Daniel, as if they were the only two people in the ballroom. "I've never danced before," she said matter-of-factly. "I mean, not the way other people dance. But I feel the music just like they do, and I think you do too, so I was wondering." She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. "Would you like to dance with me?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Daniel felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them, felt the crushing pressure of social expectations and economic hierarchies, and all the unspoken rules that governed interactions between people like him and people like the little girl sitting before him. But all he could see were Emma's eyes, hopeful, brave, and completely without guile. All he could hear was the music that had touched both their souls. And all he could think about was his daughter Lily, who would be so proud of her daddy if she could see him being kind to another little girl who just wanted someone to notice that she existed, that she mattered, that she deserved to be part of the beauty instead of just watching from the sidelines. The ballroom held its collective breath as Daniel Rodriguez, invisible janitor and single father, stood at the crossroads between safety and courage, between the life he knew and the moment that would define who he really was. Daniel's throat went dry as dust. His calloused hands, still gripping the cleaning cloth, began to tremble with a barely perceptible shake that had nothing to do with the ballroom's air conditioning. The simple question, "Would you like to dance with me?" echoed in his mind like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of panic that spread through his entire being. Dance? Here? In front of these people? He could feel the weight of every gaze in the Aurora Grand Ballroom pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. 300 of Seattle's wealthiest and most influential citizens had turned their attention to this moment, their conversations dying away to create a silence so profound that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The string quartet continued playing, but the music now seemed distant and surreal, like something heard through water. Daniel's first instinct was to step back, to retreat into the shadows where he belonged. His body actually began the motion, a small, unconscious shuffle backward, toward the service corridor, where he could disappear among the kitchen staff and pretend this conversation had never happened. But Emma's eyes held him in place like gravity, their unwavering trust and hope creating an invisible tether he couldn't break. I can't," he whispered, his voice so low that only Emma could hear. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "I'm sorry, Miss Emma, but I'm working. I'm not supposed to." He gestured helplessly at his coveralls, at the cleaning cart stationed nearby, at the obvious gulf between his world and hers. How could he explain to this brave little girl that some boundaries weren't meant to be crossed? That people like him didn't dance with people like her, especially not in places like this? Emma's expression didn't change. She didn't look hurt or disappointed, merely curious, as if Daniel had presented her with an interesting puzzle to solve. "You're not supposed to what?" she asked gently. "Be kind, be yourself, feel music?" The questions hit Daniel like physical blows. He opened his mouth to respond, to explain about proper behavior and social hierarchies, and all the unwritten rules that governed interactions between the wealthy and the working class. But the words wouldn't come. How do you explain a lifetime of being invisible to someone who was looking directly at you, really seeing you, for the first time in years? Behind Emma, Daniel could see the crowd of gala attendees forming a loose circle around them. Some faces showed curiosity, others amusement, a few barely concealed disgust. He caught fragments of whispered conversations drifting through the air like smoke. Is that man bothering the Hartwell girl? Should someone call security? Inappropriate behavior with a child. Where are her parents? Probably after money, they always are. Each whisper was a small knife to Daniel's dignity. These people didn't know him, didn't know about the double shifts he worked to keep Lily in clean clothes and healthy food, didn't know about the bedtime stories he read with a flashlight when the electricity got cut off, didn't know about the way he saved every penny for months to buy his daughter a single Christmas present. All they saw was his uniform, his roughened hands, his presence in their rarefied world, and they made their judgments accordingly. Daniel felt his face burning with shame and something dangerously close to anger. Not at Emma, never at Emma, but at the system that made her simple invitation feel like crossing a minefield. At the society that taught children to see people like him as less than human. At himself, for being in a position where a little girl's kindness felt like charity. "Emma!" The sharp voice cut through the music and murmurs like a blade. Rebecca Hartwell had finally pushed through the crowd, her emerald dress slightly disheveled from her urgent journey across the ballroom. Her face was a carefully controlled mask of mortification and barely restrained panic. "Emma, what are you doing? Come away from there immediately." Rebecca's eyes flicked to Daniel with the kind of dismissive assessment reserved for service workers who had overstepped their bounds. She didn't see a man struggling with a moment of impossible beauty. She saw a problem to be handled, a situation to be contained before it could damage her reputation or her daughter's safety. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said to Daniel, though her tone suggested she was anything but. "My daughter sometimes doesn't understand appropriate boundaries. She's been dealing with some challenges and doesn't always recognize social situations properly." The words hit Daniel like a slap. Challenges. As if Emma's disability somehow explained away her capacity for genuine human connection. As if her physical limitations meant her emotional intelligence couldn't be trusted. He had heard similar language before, the way people talked about Lily when they discovered she was being raised by a single father who cleaned buildings for a living. The subtle implication that circumstances, whether disability, poverty, or any deviation from the norm, made someone less capable of authentic feeling. But Emma wasn't backing down. If anything, her mother's interruption seemed to strengthen her resolve. She maneuvered her wheelchair slightly, positioning herself more squarely between Daniel and Rebecca, creating a small barrier of defiance in lavender silk. "I understand perfectly well, Mom," Emma said, her voice carrying the clear, ringing authority that only children possess when they know they're absolutely right. "I asked Daniel if he would like to dance with me. I'm still waiting for his answer." The crowd pressed closer, phones held high, social media feeds being updated in real time. Daniel could see the headlines forming in his mind. "Janitor harasses disabled child at charity gala." Working man attempts to exploit billionaire's daughter. Security breach at Pinnacle Foundation event. His job would be gone by morning. His reputation, what little he had, would be destroyed. And Lily. What would this mean for Lily? His hands clenched into fists around the cleaning cloth, his knuckles white with tension. Every survival instinct he had developed over years of economic hardship screamed at him to walk away, to apologize for the misunderstanding, to fade back into invisibility before this situation spiraled completely out of control. But then Emma did something that changed everything. She reached out with one small hand and gently touched his wrist, not grabbing, not demanding, just the lightest contact, skin to skin, human to human. Her touch was warm and completely without fear, as if she trusted him absolutely despite having known him for all of 5 minutes. "My daddy taught me that dancing isn't about your feet," she said quietly, her words meant for Daniel alone but carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. "He said it's about your heart, and you have a good heart, Daniel, I can tell." This simple statement broke something inside Daniel's chest. When was the last time someone had seen goodness in him instead of just need? When was the last time someone had looked past his circumstances to the man underneath? Emma's words carried no pity, no condescension, just a child's clear-eyed recognition of character. He thought about Lily again, about the conversations they would have when she was older. Would he be able to tell her about the time he chose courage over comfort? About the moment he decided that human dignity mattered more than social expectations? Or would he have to explain why he walked away from a little girl who saw him as worthy of friendship, worthy of a dance, worthy of being treated like any other person in that glittering ballroom? The music swelled around them, Pachelbel's cannon building toward its most beautiful passage. The crowd waited, phones recording, judgment poised like swords above his head. Rebecca Hartwell stood frozen, caught between protecting her daughter and managing a public relations disaster. And Emma sat in her wheelchair, her hands still resting lightly on his wrist, her dark eyes full of patient hope and unshakable faith in his fundamental decency. Daniel Rodriguez, invisible janitor and devoted father, stood at the fulcrum of a choice that would define not just his own future, but the kind of world his daughter would inherit. A world where walls between people could be crossed, or one where they remained forever intact. The next words he spoke would determine which world won. The crisp sound of polished shoes against marble cut through the musical tension like scissors through silk. Heavy, authoritative footsteps approached from multiple directions, creating a percussion of power that made several guests instinctively step back. The cavalry had arrived, and they wore black suits with earpieces. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to Marcus Sterling, head of security for Emerald Crown Resort, a man whose 20-year career in executive protection had taught him to identify potential threats from across a crowded room. His steel-gray eyes assessed the scene with professional efficiency. Agitated billionaire, disabled child in vulnerable position, working-class male in close proximity. In his experience, situations like this rarely ended well for anyone involved. Behind Sterling came a small army of authority figures, each representing a different layer of the social order that was now rushing to restore itself. There was Janet Morrison, the Pinnacle Foundation's event coordinator, her clipboard clutched like a shield and her face flushed with the particular panic that comes when a meticulously planned gala begins to deviate from script. Beside her walked Thomas Blackstone, the resort's general manager, his expression suggesting that someone's employment would be terminated before the evening was over. Most intimidating of all was the figure bringing up the rear, Alexander Cross, Rebecca Hartwell's personal attorney and fixer, a man who specialized in making inconvenient situations disappear with the ruthless efficiency of a digital deletion. Cross had been attending the gala as Rebecca's guest, but his transformation from social companion to crisis manager was complete. His phone was already in his hand, likely preparing to execute whatever damage control protocols the situation might require. "Mrs. Hartwell," Sterling continued, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to diffusing volatile situations. "I need you and your daughter to step back, please. We'll handle this from here." Rebecca felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, adults were taking control. Finally, this embarrassing spectacle could be contained and resolved with the discretion that someone of her stature deserved. She reached for Emma's wheelchair, intending to pull her daughter back from what she was increasingly viewing as a dangerous interaction. But Emma wasn't moving. If anything, she seemed to settle more firmly into her chair, her small hands gripping the armrests with surprising determination. "Handle what?" she asked, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the now silent ballroom. "I asked my friend Daniel a question. I'm still waiting for his answer." The word "friend" hit the assembled authority figures like a small, explosive device. In their world, relationships were carefully categorized and controlled. There were clients and service providers, donors and recipients, employees and employers. But friends? Across class lines? Between a billionaire's daughter and a janitor? The concept was so foreign, it was almost incomprehensible. "Miss Hartwell," Janet Morrison stepped forward, her voice taking on the patronizing tone adults often used with children they considered to be misbehaving. "I'm sure you don't understand, but this gentleman has work to do. He's not here as a guest. He can't just stop working to play with you." The word "play" made Emma's dark eyes flash with something that might have been anger. "Play?" she repeated, her voice sharp with offended dignity. "I didn't ask him to play. I asked him to dance. There's a difference." Thomas Blackstone cleared his throat, the sound carrying the weight of managerial authority. When he spoke, his words were directed not at Emma, but at Daniel, as if the child were merely an obstacle to be worked around rather than a person to be addressed directly. "Rodriguez." Blackstone's voice carried the particular chill that came with the power to destroy someone's livelihood with a single sentence. "You're causing a disturbance. I need you to return to your duties immediately. We'll discuss your behavior tomorrow morning in my office." The threat was unmistakable. Daniel felt his stomach drop as if he were falling from a great height. 3 years of employment, 3 years of steady paychecks that kept Lily fed and housed and safe, 3 years of building something resembling stability in their chaotic world, all of it balanced on the edge of a cliff. He could see his supervisor, Maria Santos, watching from the service entrance, her face a mask of concern and helplessness. She had tried to warn him about situations like this, about the invisible lines that could never be crossed. But it was Alexander Cross who delivered the killing blow, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of legal consequence. "Mrs. Hartwell, I think we need to consider the implications here," Cross said, his words carefully chosen for maximum impact. "A resort employee engaging with a minor guest without parental permission raises serious liability concerns. Child endangerment laws are quite specific about appropriate interactions between adults and children, particularly when there's such a significant power differential involved." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Child endangerment. The phrase reframed Daniel's entire presence not as that of a kind man responding to a child's invitation, but as a potential predator, a threat to be neutralized. Several guests stepped back involuntarily, their expressions shifting from curiosity to suspicion and disgust. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. This was worse than losing his job. This was about destroying his reputation, his character, his very identity as a father. If even a whisper of such an accusation found its way to Child Protective Services, if Lily's school heard rumors, if his neighbors began to wonder, he thought of his daughter, asleep at Mrs. Chen's house, trusting that her daddy would come home safely from work as he always did. What would happen to her if these people destroyed him? "That's not," Daniel began, his voice cracking with desperation. "I would never, she just asked me to dance. I didn't do anything inappropriate." "Of course you didn't," Cross replied smoothly, his tone suggesting exactly the opposite. "But appearances matter, don't they? And the appearance here is quite concerning. A working-class man, alone with a vulnerable child, away from her parents' supervision." Social media is already buzzing with videos and speculation. The story writes itself, doesn't it? As if summoned by his words, the soft chime of phone notifications began to ripple through the crowd. Twitter alerts, Instagram posts, Facebook updates. The digital wildfire was already spreading beyond the ballroom walls. Daniel could see guests glancing at their screens, their expressions shifting as they read whatever narrative was being constructed in real time. Rebecca felt her own phone buzzing insistently in her clutch. Her public relations team was probably already fielding calls from gossip bloggers and entertainment news sites. The Hartwell Industries stock price could fluctuate based on something as simple as a poorly timed photograph or an unfortunate headline. Her entire empire, built on careful reputation management and strategic image control, suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. "Emma, we're leaving, now." Rebecca's voice carried the iron authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. She reached for her daughter's wheelchair again, this time with the clear intention of physically removing her from the situation. But Emma's hands shot out, gripping the wheels of her chair to prevent movement. For a 9-year-old girl with limited physical strength, she displayed remarkable resistance to her mother's attempts at control. "No," Emma said simply. The word wasn't shouted or dramatic, just stated with the quiet finality of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "I asked Daniel a question, and he deserves the chance to answer it without all of you bullying him." The assembled authority figures exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to plan. Children, especially disabled children, were supposed to be compliant, grateful for adult intervention and protection. They weren't supposed to use words like bullying or show such clear understanding of power dynamics. Sterling stepped closer to Daniel, his hand resting casually on his radio, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from the child and return to your work area. If you refuse, I'll have to treat this as a security incident." A security incident. Daniel knew what that meant. Handcuffs, police involvement, his name in a report that would follow him for the rest of his life. Even if no charges were filed, even if the truth eventually came out, the mere fact of being detained in connection with a child endangerment allegation would make him unemployable in any job that required background checks. He looked down at Emma, still sitting defiantly in her wheelchair, her small face set with determination that reminded him achingly of Lily when she was fighting for something she believed in. This brave little girl had seen something in him worth defending, worth risking social embarrassment for, worth standing up to the combined weight of wealth and authority for. But the cost was becoming clear, not just to him, but potentially to her as well. Already he could see the calculation in her mother's eyes, the way Cross was taking notes on his phone, the manner in which the crowd was beginning to view Emma not as courageous but as troubled, difficult, a child whose judgment couldn't be trusted. His choice wasn't just about whether to dance. It was about whether his moment of human connection was worth the price that both he and Emma might have to pay. The little girl who had seen his worth as a person deserved better than to be destroyed by the same system that was threatening to destroy him. The authorities waited, their collective power focused like a laser beam on this one moment of decision. And Daniel Rodriguez, caught between love and fear, between dignity and survival, prepared to make the choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone he cared about. In the suffocating silence that followed Sterling's ultimatum, Emma Hartwell did something that no one, not the security chief, not the lawyers, not even her own mother, expected. She began to laugh. Not the brittle, nervous laughter of someone cracking under pressure, but something genuine and crystalline, like silver bells ringing in morning air. The sound was so unexpected, so completely at odds with the tension crackling through the Aurora Grand Ballroom, that it stopped every authority figure mid-breath. Even Alexander Cross paused in his note-taking, his phone frozen halfway to his ear. "You know what's funny?" Emma said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed space as her laughter faded into something more contemplative. "All of you are so worried about protecting me from Daniel, but none of you have asked me what I need protection from." She maneuvered her wheelchair in a slow, deliberate circle, her dark eyes taking in each face around her. The security guards with their hands on their radios, the lawyers with their phones full of liability concerns, the event coordinators with their clipboards of social protocols. Her gaze lingered on each of them with the kind of clear-eyed assessment that made grown adults suddenly feel very small. "Do you want to know what I need protection from?" Emma asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I need protection from people who see my wheelchair before they see me. I need protection from adults who think my disability makes me stupid, or helpless, or incapable of making my own choices. I need protection from a world that tells me I should be grateful just to be included, even if that inclusion means sitting quietly in the corner while everyone else gets to live." The words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in her description. Rebecca felt her face burning as she realized her daughter was describing not just society's prejudices, but her own overprotective instincts as well. Emma turned her wheelchair to face Daniel directly, and when she spoke again, her voice held a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 9 years. "Daniel, look at me," she said quietly. "Really look at me. Not at what these people think you should see, not at what they're trying to make you afraid of, but at who I actually am." Daniel found himself obeying without conscious thought. He looked, really looked, at the little girl in the lavender dress. What he saw wasn't a vulnerable child in need of protection, wasn't a billionaire's daughter who might destroy his life with a careless word, wasn't even a disabled girl to be pitied or inspired by. What he saw was simply Emma, intelligent, brave, lonely, and achingly familiar. She reminded him of Lily, but not in the ways he had expected. It wasn't their physical circumstances that connected them. Lily could run and jump and dance on legs that worked perfectly well. It was something deeper. It was the look in Emma's eyes that he recognized. That particular combination of hope and resignation that came from being constantly underestimated by the adults who claimed to have your best interests at heart. "You see it, don't you?" Emma asked softly. "You see that I'm not asking you to dance because I feel sorry for myself, or because I want to cause trouble, or because I don't understand the consequences. I'm asking because I've been watching you for 20 minutes, and you're the only person in this entire ballroom who moves to music the way it's supposed to be felt. You're the only one who understands that dancing isn't about showing off or following rules or impressing other people." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and when she continued, her words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "My father died when I was 6, Emma said, the simple statement falling into the ballroom like a stone into still water. "He was a dancer, actually, ballet. He used to lift me up and spin me around our living room, and he'd tell me that dancing was just another way of talking, except instead of using words, you used your whole body to tell a story." The revelation sent ripples of shock through the crowd. Rebecca's face went white. This wasn't the sanitized version of family history they usually shared at public events. The official story was that Emma's father had died in a car accident. A tragic but simple narrative that didn't require uncomfortable questions or deeper explanations. But Emma wasn't finished. He didn't die in a car crash like Mom tells people, he killed himself. The words were spoken without drama, just stated as fact. But they hit the ballroom like a physical force. He couldn't handle having a disabled daughter. He couldn't handle the stares, the questions, the way people looked at our family like we were broken. Rebecca made a small, choked sound, reaching toward her daughter, but Emma continued relentlessly. "Before he died, he stopped dancing with me. He stopped seeing me. He started looking at me the same way all of you are looking at Daniel right now, like I was a problem to be managed, a situation to be controlled, a liability to be minimized." Emma's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed forward. "The last thing he ever said to me was that he was sorry I would never be normal." The silence that followed was deafening. Phones were lowered. Whispered conversations died away completely. Even the string quartet seemed to fade into the background, as if the musicians themselves were holding their breath. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but her voice remained steady. "So when I see someone like Daniel, someone who looks at me and sees a person instead of a condition, someone who moves to music the way my father used to before he forgot how to see me as his daughter instead of his burden, yeah, I'm going to ask him to dance, because maybe, just maybe, for 3 minutes, I can remember what it felt like to be someone's partner instead of their charity case." Daniel felt tears stinging his eyes. This brave little girl had just laid her soul bare in front of 300 strangers, had exposed her deepest wounds and greatest fears, all to defend his right to be treated as a human being. The courage it must have taken, the strength required to stand up not just to authority figures but to her own mother, to the entire social structure that governed her world. It was breathtaking. Ancha. But more than that, her words had revealed something he hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just about dancing. This was about dignity. About the right to be seen as complete human beings, despite the circumstances that society used to diminish them. Emma was fighting not just for a dance, but for the radical idea that worth wasn't determined by wealth or ability or social status, but by the simple fact of being human. "You want to know why I chose Daniel?" Emma asked, turning to address the crowd directly. "Because in 20 minutes of watching him work, I saw more grace, more respect for this space and these people, more quiet dignity than I've seen from anyone else here tonight. Because when the music started, he didn't just hear it. He felt it, the same way I do. Because he's the only person in this room who looked at me tonight and saw someone worth talking to, not someone to be managed or protected or inspired by. She turned back to Daniel and her voice dropped to something intimate and urgent. I know you're scared. I know they're threatening your job, your reputation, your whole life. I know you have a daughter to think about. And I know what it costs to stand up to people like this. She gestured at the assembled authority figures. But I also know that somewhere inside you is the man who used to dance in his kitchen, who used to spin his daughter around just because music was playing. That man wouldn't let fear stop him from showing a lonely little girl that she matters. Emma's eyes held Daniel's with unwavering intensity. I'm not asking you to risk everything for me. I'm asking you to risk everything for the idea that people like us, people who don't fit into their neat little categories, deserve to take up space in the world. I'm asking you to dance with me not despite what they might do to us, but because of it. Because someone needs to show them that we're not afraid of their judgment, that we refuse to be invisible just because our existence makes them uncomfortable. The challenge hung in the air between them, not just an invitation to dance, but a call to revolution, quiet, dignified, but absolute in its rejection of a world that sought to diminish them both. Emma had offered Daniel something far more valuable than a moment of music. She had offered him the chance to reclaim his own worth, to show his daughter and himself that some things mattered more than security, that some stands were worth taking regardless of the cost. Around them, the ballroom waited in breathless silence for Daniel Rodriguez to decide not just whether he would dance, but what kind of man he would choose to be. Emma's words hit Daniel like a seismic shift, cracking open something deep inside his chest that he had spent years carefully sealing away. The mention of dancing in kitchens, of spinning daughters in living rooms, of fathers who forgot how to see their children. It was as if she had reached directly into his most protected memories and pulled them into the harsh light of the Aurora Grand Ballroom. His knees nearly buckled as the past came rushing back with devastating clarity. Maria. Her name whispered through his mind like a prayer, like a wound that had never properly healed. Maria Rodriguez, his wife of 8 years, the woman who had taught him that dancing wasn't about technique or training, but about trust. The woman who had laughed when he stepped on her toes during their wedding dance, who had slow danced with him in their tiny apartment kitchen while dinner burned on the stove, who had insisted they could still find music in the world even when their bank account showed $12.37. Maria, who had died giving birth to their daughter. Daniel's hand instinctively moved to his chest, pressing against the spot where he kept her wedding ring on a chain beneath his work uniform. He had worn it there for 7 years, a talisman against forgetting, against the world's insistence that grief had an expiration date and moving forward meant leaving the dead behind. But it wasn't just Maria's death that had stopped his dancing. It was what came after. The months following Maria's funeral had been a blur of sleepless nights, crying babies, and well-meaning relatives who kept insisting that Lily would be better off with her grandmother, with Maria's sister, with anyone who could provide the kind of stability that a grieving widower working 2 minimum-wage jobs clearly couldn't offer. The court battles had been quiet but brutal, fought in family services offices and mediation rooms where his love for his daughter was weighed against his financial statements and found wanting. Mr. Rodriguez, he could still hear the social worker's voice, clinical and kind in the way that preceded devastating news. We understand you love Lily very much, but love isn't always enough. A child needs security, structure, opportunities. Can you really provide those things? The question had haunted him for years. Could he? Was his fierce, desperate love for his daughter enough to compensate for the apartment with the leaking ceiling? The nights when he had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries? The way other parents looked at him during school events, when he could attend them at all, with that particular mixture of pity and judgment reserved for single fathers who were clearly struggling? He had kept Lily, fought for her with everything he had, but the cost had been pieces of himself. Dancing reminded him too much of Maria, of the dreams they had shared, of the life they had planned that would never come to pass. Music became dangerous because it carried memory, and memory carried pain that threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed survival mechanisms. So he had stopped. Stopped dancing, stopped singing, stopped moving to rhythm. He had become functional, efficient, invisible. He worked his shifts, paid his bills, read bedtime stories, helped with homework, and convinced himself that being a good father meant being reliable rather than joyful, steady rather than spontaneous. But Emma had seen through all of that protective armor. Somehow, this remarkable little girl had recognized the ghost of who he used to be, had spotted the remnants of grace that he thought he had successfully buried beneath years of pragmatic survival. "You don't know what you're asking," Daniel whispered, his voice so low that only Emma could hear him. The words came out cracked and broken, carrying the weight of every dance he hadn't danced, every song he hadn't sung, every moment of beauty he had denied himself in service of simply getting through each day. But Emma's expression didn't change. If anything, her dark eyes seemed to grow more certain, more compassionate. "Yes, I do," she said simply. "I'm asking you to remember who you were before the world taught you to be ashamed of taking up space." The phrase hit him like lightning. Before the world taught you to be ashamed of taking up space. When had that happened? When had he started making himself smaller, quieter, less noticeable? When had he begun to believe that his presence was something to be apologized for rather than celebrated? He thought about Lily asleep at Mrs. Chen's house, trusting that her father would come home safely as he always did. What would she think if she could see him now? Would she be proud of the man who chose safety over courage, survival over dignity? Or would she recognize something in his hesitation that she had inherited? Some fundamental belief that people like them were meant to accept whatever scraps of recognition the world was willing to offer. Lily was already showing signs of his learned invisibility. At 7 years old, she had begun to apologize for things that weren't her fault, to make herself small in rooms full of other children, to assume that her needs were less important than everyone else's comfort. She had learned, without him ever meaning to teach her, that being the daughter of a janitor meant being grateful for whatever attention she received, and never, ever asking for more. The realization was like a physical blow. He had been so focused on providing for his daughter's basic needs, food, shelter, safety, that he had forgotten about her need to see herself reflected in a father who believed he deserved respect, who moved through the world with dignity, who understood that his work had value regardless of how society chose to price it. "My wife died having my daughter," Daniel heard himself saying, the words emerging without conscious decision. It was information he had never shared with strangers, barely discussed, even with close friends. But something about Emma's brutal honesty, her willingness to expose her own wounds in defense of their shared humanity, demanded equal vulnerability in return. "The doctors said it was a complication that no one could have predicted or prevented, but I spent years believing it was somehow my fault. That if I had been a better husband, made more money, been able to afford better care." He trailed off, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "After she died, everyone kept telling me that Lily needed stability, needed a proper home. They made me feel like loving her wasn't enough, like being her father was something I had to earn, rather than something I simply was." Emma nodded as if she understood completely. "And so you stopped dancing?" "I stopped everything," Daniel admitted. "I stopped listening to music. Stopped moving my body in ways that felt good. Stopped believing I deserved moments of joy. I convinced myself that being a good father meant being invisible, reliable, grateful for whatever work I could find. I taught myself to disappear." "But you never really disappeared," Emma observed, her voice gentle but insistent. "I saw you tonight, really saw you. The way you moved through this room like you belonged here. Like your presence was a gift rather than an intrusion. The way you cleaned not just efficiently but beautifully, like you understood that taking care of spaces and people was sacred work." Her words were reshaping something fundamental in Daniel's understanding of himself. For years he had seen his janitorial work as a necessary compromise, a temporary solution that had somehow become permanent, but Emma was describing it as something else entirely, as a form of service that carried its own dignity, its own worth. "Lily deserves to see her father dance," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. "Not because dancing will solve all your problems or make the world suddenly fair, but because she needs to know that joy isn't a luxury you can't afford. She needs to see that taking up space, claiming moments of beauty, insisting on your own worth, these aren't selfish acts, they're revolutionary ones." Daniel felt tears he had been holding back for 7 years finally beginning to fall. This 9-year-old girl had somehow identified the exact fear that had been controlling his life. that claiming joy, demanding recognition, taking up space was somehow selfish when there were bills to pay and responsibilities to meet and a daughter depending on his ability to be strong. But Emma was offering him a different definition of strength, not the kind that came from enduring suffering silently, but the kind that came from refusing to let that suffering define the boundaries of what was possible. The kind that said a janitor could be graceful, a single father could be joyful, and a man who cleaned ballrooms could also dance in them. Around them, the crowd continued to wait, their phones still recording, their judgments still poised like swords. But for the first time in 7 years, Daniel Rodriguez found himself caring less about their opinion than about the opinion of the remarkable little girl sitting before him, challenging him to remember who he had been before grief and fear had taught him to make himself small. The music was still playing, Emma was still waiting, and somewhere deep inside his chest, in the place where he kept Maria's ring and his daughter's laughter and all the dreams he had convinced himself to abandon, something that had been sleeping for years was finally beginning to wake up. The moment hung suspended in time like a soap bubble balanced on the edge of a blade, fragile, perfect, and destined to either float into something beautiful or shatter into irretrievable fragments. Daniel could feel his entire life pivoting on this single breath, this one choice that would determine not just his immediate future but the legacy he would leave for his daughter. Emma waited with the patience of someone who understood that real decisions couldn't be rushed. Around them, the Aurora Grand Ballroom had become a coliseum of expectations, with 300 witnesses holding their collective breath while their phones continued their silent documentation of what might become either a moment of profound humanity or a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing social boundaries. But for Daniel, the crowd had begun to fade into background noise, the lawyers with their liability concerns, the security guards with their radios, the event coordinators with their clipboards. They all seemed suddenly small and distant compared to the enormous presence of this 9-year-old girl, who had somehow managed to see straight through to the core of who he was, beneath all the layers of protection he had built around himself. He thought about Lily, not as the sleeping child waiting for him at Mrs. Chen's house, but as the woman she would become. What would she remember about her father? Would she recall a man who had been too afraid to claim his own dignity, too intimidated by authority to stand up for what was right? Or would she remember the night her daddy chose courage over comfort, love over fear, dancing over safety? The image of his daughter as an adult, perhaps sitting in her own workplace someday, facing her own moment of choice between what was safe and what was right, crystallized everything for Daniel. Would she have the strength to stand up for herself if she had never seen her father model that kind of bravery? Would she believe she deserved respect if she had grown up watching him accept disrespect as the natural order of things? More importantly, what was he teaching her right now in this moment through his hesitation? That people like them should be grateful for whatever scraps of acknowledgement the powerful were willing to throw their way. That dignity was a luxury they couldn't afford. That taking up space in the world was something to be apologized for rather than celebrated? Daniel's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against the chain that held Maria's wedding ring. For 7 years, he had carried her memory like a weight, using his grief as both armor and anchor. But suddenly, Emma's words were reframing everything he thought he knew about honoring the dead. Maria hadn't fallen in love with a man who apologized for his existence. She had chosen to marry someone who spun her around their tiny kitchen, who sang off-key in the shower, who believed that joy was something you created rather than something you waited for permission to experience. The Daniel she had loved would never have taught his daughter to make herself small to accommodate other people's comfort. "Maria would be ashamed of me," Daniel whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Not ashamed of his work, not ashamed of his circumstances, not ashamed of the struggles they had faced as a young couple trying to build a life together. She would be ashamed that he had stopped dancing, stopped believing in his own worth, stopped teaching their daughter that she had every right to take up space in the world. Emma's eyes softened with understanding. "No," she said gently, "she would be proud that you survived. She would be proud that you kept your daughter safe and loved. But she would also want you to remember that surviving isn't the same as living." The distinction hit Daniel like lightning. For 7 years, he had focused so intently on survival, paying bills, keeping jobs, avoiding trouble, maintaining the delicate balance that kept his small family afloat, that he had forgotten what it meant to actually live. He had taught himself to be grateful for invisibility, to find safety in insignificance, to measure success by how little attention he attracted, rather than by how much joy he created. But Emma was offering him something different. Not just a dance, but a philosophy. The radical idea that people like them, people who worked with their hands, people who struggled financially, people who existed on the margins of society's awareness, deserved more than mere survival. They deserved celebration. They deserved to be seen, acknowledged, valued, not for their productivity or their compliance, but for their humanity. Daniel looked around the ballroom one more time, taking in the faces of the authority figures who surrounded them like a wall of judgment. Marcus Sterling with his hand on his radio, ready to treat kindness as a security threat. Alexander Cross with his phone full of legal weapons designed to destroy lives for the crime of crossing invisible boundaries. Thomas Blackstone with his power to erase someone's livelihood with a single phone call. Janet Morrison with her clipboard of social protocols that treated human connection as a violation of proper procedure. These people had built their entire existence around maintaining systems that kept certain kinds of people in certain kinds of places. They had created a world where a janitor asking a disabled girl to dance could be framed as child endangerment, where a moment of genuine human connection could be twisted into a liability concern, where dignity itself could be treated as a form of insubordination. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the power of a father's love and a little girl's wisdom. Daniel began to move, not toward the service corridor and safety, but toward his cleaning cart. Every eye in the ballroom tracked his movement as he reached down and began to unfasten his tool belt, the leather worn smooth by 3 years of 12-hour shifts. The sound of the buckle clicking open seemed to echo through the vast space like a gunshot. He set the belt down carefully on the cart, then reached for the name tag clipped to his chest pocket. Rodriguez D. Facilities. The plastic rectangle read, reducing 3 years of dedicated service to a bureaucratic designation. He unclipped it slowly, deliberately, holding it for a moment like someone examining a fossil of who he used to be. Then he placed it gently on the cart beside his tool belt. Rebecca Hartwell gasped audibly. Several guests stepped forward, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about long after the Aurora Grand Ballroom had been restored to its pristine state and the Pinnacle Foundation Gala had become another line item in the social calendar. But Daniel wasn't finished. He pulled off his work gloves, the rubber fingers stained with years of honest labor, and laid them beside his name tag. Then he began to roll up the sleeves of his navy coveralls, exposing forearms marked with small scars from equipment and rough surfaces, the kind of evidence that came with work that actually mattered. "Mr. Rodriguez, what are you doing?" Thomas Blackstone's voice carried a note of panic. This wasn't how these situations were supposed to unfold. The working-class person was supposed to back down, apologize, retreat to their designated space with appropriate gratitude for not being fired immediately. Daniel looked up at his supervisor, and for the first time in 3 years he met the man's eyes as an equal rather than a subordinate. "I'm getting ready to dance," Daniel said simply. The words hit the ballroom like a seismic shift. Not, "I'm sorry for the disturbance." Not, "I'll return to my duties immediately." Not, "Please don't fire me." Just a simple statement of intention that carried the weight of absolute conviction. Emma's face lit up with something that transcended mere happiness. It was recognition, validation, the profound joy that comes from being truly seen and understood by another human being. She straightened in her wheelchair, her own spine growing taller as she prepared to receive the gift Daniel was offering. Not just a dance, but a declaration that both of their lives had value, that both of their stories deserved to be told, that both of them had the right to claim space in a world that had spent years trying to convince them they were invisible. Daniel walked slowly toward Emma, each step a small act of revolution. Behind him, he could hear the urgent whispers of authority figures realizing they were losing control of the narrative. Phones buzzed with calls to public relations teams. Security protocols were being debated in hushed tones, and legal strategies were being frantically recalculated. But none of it mattered anymore. Daniel Rodriguez, invisible janitor and devoted father, had remembered who he was before the world taught him to be ashamed. And he was ready to show his daughter, and everyone else, what it looked like when love won over fear, when dignity triumphed over safety, when a man decided that some things were worth dancing for. Daniel stopped 3 feet from Emma's wheelchair, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to notice the way her small hands trembled with anticipation rather than nervousness. The space between them felt charged with electricity, as if the air itself was holding its breath for what came next. "Princess," Daniel said softly, the endearment coming naturally despite their brief acquaintance. "May I have this dance?" Emma's smile could have powered the crystal chandeliers above them. "I thought you'd never ask," she replied, her voice carrying a mixture of joy and relief that made Daniel's chest tighten with emotion. But as Daniel reached toward her, uncertainty flickered across his features. He had made the decision to dance, had committed himself to this moment of revolutionary courage, but the practical reality was suddenly daunting. How did one dance with someone in a wheelchair? How could he ensure Emma's safety while still honoring the dignity of the moment? How could he make this beautiful without making it patronizing? Emma, with the intuitive wisdom that had marked every interaction they'd shared, recognized his hesitation immediately. "Daniel," she said gently, "I've been thinking about this for 20 minutes. I know exactly how we can make this work, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Daniel nodded, surprised by how easily the trust came. In a ballroom full of people who had spent the evening treating him as either invisible or threatening, Emma remained the only person whose judgment he could rely on completely. "First," Emma said, maneuvering her wheelchair slightly, "dancing isn't about your feet. It's about your heart, your intention, the way you move through space with someone else. My legs might not work, but everything else does just fine." She gestured to the space beside her wheelchair. "Stand there, but at an angle so we're not facing the same direction. We're going to create something they've never seen before." Daniel positioned himself as she indicated, and Emma immediately reached out her left hand to take his right. Her grip was firm, confident, warm, with the kind of touch that spoke of absolute trust. With her other hand, she gestured to the string quartet, who had been playing background music but now seemed uncertain whether to continue. "Could you play something with a waltz tempo?" Emma called out, her clear voice carrying across the ballroom. "Something beautiful, but not too fast." The quartet exchanged glances, then the violinist nodded and counted off quietly. The opening notes of Moon River began to float through the space, sweet and melancholy and perfect for the moment that was unfolding. Emma began to move first, and Daniel understood immediately why she had positioned them as she had. Instead of traditional partnered dancing, she was creating something entirely new, a choreography that honored both of their bodies exactly as they were. Her wheelchair became part of the dance rather than an obstacle to it. She moved in gentle arcs, using her free hand to guide her chair in slow, graceful circles while maintaining her connection to Daniel. He found himself moving alongside her, matching her rhythm, allowing her to lead in a way that felt natural rather than forced. When she moved forward, he stepped backward. When she turned left, he moved right, creating a pattern that was both synchronized and complementary. But it was more than just movement. Emma had been right about dancing being a conversation. Without words, they were telling a story, about finding each other in unexpected places, about refusing to let the world's limitations define what was possible, about the radical act of claiming joy in the face of judgment. Daniel felt something loosening in his chest, something that had been wound tight for 7 years. His body remembered rhythms it thought it had forgotten. His feet found steps that came not from training but from some deeper place where music lived. For the first time since Maria's death, he wasn't just surviving a moment, he was inhabiting it completely. Emma laughed as they moved together, a sound of pure delight that seemed to sparkle in the air around them. The laugh was infectious, and Daniel found himself smiling. Not the careful apologetic smile he had learned to wear around authority figures, but something genuine and unguarded and completely his own. "See?" Emma said as they continued their unique waltz. "This is what I meant about grace. You move like you understand that your body is something to celebrate, not something to apologize for." Around them, the Aurora Grand Ballroom had fallen into something approaching reverent silence. The authority figures who had been so urgent in their desire to end this interaction now stood frozen, recognizing that what they were witnessing had transcended their categories of appropriate and inappropriate, safe and dangerous, acceptable and problematic. This wasn't a janitor bothering a disabled child. This wasn't a liability waiting to happen. This wasn't even, strictly speaking, traditional dancing. This was pure human connection, the kind that reminded everyone present why music existed in the first place, why people gathered in beautiful spaces, why the arts mattered at all. It was the reason ballrooms were built, the reason orchestras played, the reason humans had been moving together to rhythm since the beginning of civilization. Rebecca Hartwell stood at the edge of the dance floor with tears streaming down her face, watching her daughter inhabit a joy she hadn't seen since before her father's suicide. Emma wasn't just dancing. She was luminous, radiant, completely and utterly alive in a way that made every expensive therapy session, every adaptive device, every careful protection seem suddenly inadequate compared to this moment of pure acceptance and celebration. But the transformation wasn't limited to Emma. Daniel was changing too, right there in front of 300 witnesses. His shoulders straightened as he moved. His spine lengthened. The careful, apologetic posture he had carried for years melted away, replaced by something that could only be described as dignity made visible. He wasn't dancing like someone who was afraid to take up space. He was dancing like someone who understood that his presence in the world was a gift rather than an imposition, that his story mattered, that his joy was not contingent on anyone else's permission. He was his. The song built toward its climax, and Emma guided them into something more complex, a series of turns that required Daniel to walk around her wheelchair while maintaining their hand connection, creating a visual metaphor for the way their lives had somehow orbited into this perfect, impossible moment. As they moved, Daniel felt Maria's presence not as a weight of grief, but as a blessing. He could almost hear her voice, not mournful but proud, not distant but immediate. This is who you were meant to be. This is the father our daughter deserves to see. This is the man I fell in love with. The music began to slow, approaching its gentle conclusion, and Emma brought them back to where they had started, her wheelchair positioned so they were facing each other directly. With perfect timing, they both brought their free hands to meet in the space between them, creating a bridge of connection that seemed to encompass everything they had shared: the conversation, the courage, the choice to see each other as fully human. As the final notes of Moon River faded into silence, Daniel and Emma remained motionless for a moment, both of them breathing slightly harder from the exertion but glowing with something that transcended mere happiness. They had created something together that hadn't existed before, something that couldn't be undone or diminished by whatever consequences might follow. Emma released his hand slowly, reluctantly, but her smile remained radiant. "Thank you," she whispered, but the words carried the weight of something far more profound than gratitude for a dance. She was thanking him for seeing her, for trusting her, for choosing to believe that what they could create together was worth whatever price the world might demand. Daniel bowed formally, the gesture carrying all the respect and recognition that their dance had expressed in movement. "Thank you, Princess," he replied, "for reminding me who I am." The ballroom remained suspended in that perfect silence for another heartbeat, another breath, another moment of pure possibility. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. The first clap came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a 73-year-old pediatric neurologist who had spent 40 years working with children like Emma, stood near the back of the Aurora Grand Ballroom with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her applause was slow, deliberate, each clap carrying the weight of decades spent watching society underestimate the children she treated. The sound cut through the ballroom's stunned silence like the first crack in a dam, and within seconds the entire structure of collective hesitation began to crumble. A second pair of hands joined hers. Jennifer Walsh, a young tech executive who recognized something familiar in Emma's fierce determination to be seen as complete rather than broken. Then another, Robert Chen, a venture capitalist whose own son had spina bifida, and who understood the profound courage it took for Emma to claim space in a world that preferred to see disability as inspiration rather than simply as another way of being human. But the applause that followed wasn't uniform. The Aurora Grand Ballroom fractured into distinct camps, each responding to what they had witnessed through the lens of their own experiences, fears, and prejudices. Near the orchestra, A cluster of older philanthropists clapped with the kind of enthusiastic sentimentality that suggested they viewed the dance as a heartwarming moment of charity, the wealthy helping the disadvantaged, the abled assisting the disabled, the privileged bestowing grace upon the less fortunate. Their applause carried undertones of self-congratulation, as if witnessing this moment somehow reflected well on their own generosity and open-mindedness. "How wonderful," murmured Eleanor Ashworth, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. That poor little girl finally got her moment, and that man was so kind to indulge her. The words made Daniel's jaw clench. Indulge her. As if Emma's invitation had been a childish whim rather than an act of profound insight, as if his acceptance had been condescending kindness rather than recognition of their mutual dignity. But not everyone in the ballroom was interpreting the moment through such a patronizing lens. A group of younger tech entrepreneurs, many of whom had built their fortunes by challenging established systems and disrupting traditional hierarchies, applauded with genuine appreciation for what they recognized as a masterclass in redefining power dynamics. They understood that what they had witnessed wasn't charity but revolution, two people refusing to accept the limitations that society had tried to impose on them. "Did you see how she led?" whispered Sarah Martinez, founder of a disability-focused startup, to her partner. "She didn't ask for help or accommodation. She created something entirely new and taught him how to be part of it. That's not inspiration porn, that's leadership." Near the center of the ballroom, however, a significant portion of the crowd remained conspicuously silent. These were the people for whom the evening's events represented not heartwarming triumph, but dangerous precedent. They saw Daniel's choice to dance not as courage but as insubordination, Emma's invitation not as wisdom but as inappropriate behavior that had been insufficiently managed by her mother. Alexander Cross stood among this group, his phone pressed to his ear as he conducted urgent damage control conversations with Rebecca's public relations team. His expression suggested he was already crafting narratives that would minimize the potential fallout from what he undoubtedly viewed as a public relations disaster. "We need to control the story," Cross murmured into his phone, his words audible to those standing nearby. "Frame it as a beautiful moment of inclusion, emphasize the charity angle, and make sure no one focuses on the liability issues. The last thing we need is this encouraging other service workers to think they can interact with clients' children without permission." Marcus Sterling, the security chief, remained frozen in a state of professional confusion. His training had prepared him to handle threats, disturbances, and violations of protocol. But what had just occurred defied all his categories. Was Daniel Rodriguez a security risk who had successfully manipulated a vulnerable child? Or was he exactly what he appeared to be, a decent man who had responded with kindness to an invitation offered in good faith? The uncertainty in Sterling's face reflected a broader confusion rippling through the ballroom's power structure. The people who were accustomed to controlling narratives, managing situations, and maintaining order suddenly found themselves confronting something that couldn't be easily categorized or contained. But perhaps the most interesting responses came from the service staff themselves. Along the periphery of the ballroom, waiters, kitchen workers, and event coordinators had emerged from their designated invisibility to watch the conclusion of Daniel's dance with Emma. For them, this moment carried implications that went far beyond a single interaction between a janitor and a billionaire's daughter. Maria Santos, Daniel's supervisor, stood near the service entrance, with her hand pressed to her heart, watching her employee claim a dignity she had never seen him assert before. In 3 years of working together, she had watched Daniel accept disrespect, endure condescension, and absorb the casual cruelty that came with being treated as subhuman by people who never bothered to learn his name. Now she was watching him stand in the center of Seattle's most exclusive ballroom, having danced with one of the city's most prominent children, carrying himself like someone who understood that his worth wasn't contingent on anyone else's approval. "Mijo," she whispered in Spanish, her voice thick with emotion. "Look at you, just look at you." Behind her, other service workers nodded with recognition and pride. They understood what Daniel had risked, what he had chosen, what his decision meant for all of them. He had broken the invisible barrier that kept their worlds separate from this glittering realm of wealth and influence. He had proven that dignity wasn't something you were granted, but something you claimed. The applause gradually began to fade, but the ballroom's energy remained electric with unresolved tension. Conversations erupted in clusters throughout the space, some celebratory, others concerned, many simply confused about how to process what they had witnessed. "I don't understand what just happened," admitted Victoria Sterling, wife of a prominent judge, to her companion. "Was that appropriate? Should someone have stopped it? I mean, it was sweet, but—" Her uncertainty reflected a broader struggle taking place throughout the ballroom. People who were accustomed to clear social hierarchies suddenly found themselves questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. If a janitor could dance with a billionaire's daughter, if a disabled child could lead rather than be led, if moments of genuine human connection could transcend carefully maintained boundaries, what did that mean for all the other barriers they had accepted as natural and necessary? Not everyone was willing to engage with such uncomfortable questions. Thomas Blackstone, the resort's general manager, pushed through the crowd toward where Daniel still stood beside Emma's wheelchair. His face carried the grim determination of someone preparing to restore order to a situation that had spiraled beyond acceptable parameters. "This has gone far enough," Blackstone announced loudly, his voice cutting through the various conversations. "Mr. Rodriguez, you are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises." The declaration hit the ballroom like a physical blow. The residual applause died instantly, replaced by gasps of shock and outrage from those who had been moved by the dance. Emma's face went white with horror, while Rebecca finally found her voice. "Wait," Rebecca said, stepping forward. "That's not—" But Blackstone continued relentlessly. "Furthermore, we will be conducting a full investigation into tonight's events. Inappropriate contact with a minor guest, abandonment of assigned duties, creating a public disturbance. These are serious violations that will be reported to the appropriate authorities." Daniel felt the familiar weight of inevitability settling over him. He had known this was coming, had understood the price he would pay for choosing dignity over safety, but as he looked at Emma's stricken face, at the tears forming in her dark eyes, he realized that the cost wasn't just his own anymore. The little girl who had found the courage to ask for a dance was now watching her friend be destroyed for the crime of saying yes. The system was reasserting itself with brutal efficiency, making sure that everyone understood the consequences of crossing lines that were meant to remain uncrossed. But as Daniel prepared to accept his punishment with the same quiet dignity he had brought to everything else in his life, he noticed something that made him pause. Rebecca Hartwell was walking toward him, her face set with an expression he had never seen before. And behind her, moving with the careful determination of someone who had made a decision that would change everything, came a figure that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. The most powerful person in the ballroom had been watching in silence, and now, finally, he was ready to speak. The voice that cut through Thomas Blackstone's tirade carried the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise his volume to command attention. Every conversation in the Aurora Grand Ballroom died instantly. Every head turned toward the source of that unmistakable tone. "Mr. Blackstone, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Jonathan Hartwell stepped forward from where he had been standing in the shadows near the east wall, his presence transforming the entire dynamic of the ballroom as surely as if someone had flipped a switch and changed the lighting. At 55, Rebecca's older brother carried himself with the understated confidence that came from controlling a technology empire worth $47 billion. Unlike his sister's calculated precision, Jonathan moved with the easy grace of someone who had learned that true power whispered rather than shouted. But it wasn't just his wealth that commanded attention. Jonathan Hartwell was a legend in Seattle's business community, the man who had built Hartwell Quantum from a garage startup into one of the world's most influential artificial intelligence companies. More importantly for this moment, he was known as someone who had never forgotten where he came from, the son of a mechanic and a nurse who had worked his way through community college before transferring to MIT on academic scholarships. He was also, Daniel realized with a shock of recognition, Emma's uncle, the mysterious figure who had been funding her medical treatments, her adaptive equipment, her specialized education. The man Rebecca rarely mentioned, but whose influence shaped every aspect of Emma's life. "Mr. Hartwell," Blackstone stammered, his earlier authority evaporating like morning mist. "I was just handling a situation with one of our employees. Nothing that requires your attention, sir." Jonathan's steel-gray eyes moved slowly from Blackstone to Daniel, taking in the cleaning cart with its abandoned tools, the discarded name tag, the man standing with quiet dignity beside a little girl in a wheelchair. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades learning to read people with surgical precision. "I've been watching this situation unfold for the past 30 minutes, Jonathan said calmly. From where I was standing, it appeared that Mr. Rodriguez responded with kindness and respect to my niece's invitation to dance. I'm curious to know which part of that interaction you consider grounds for termination and criminal investigation." The question hung in the air like a blade poised above Blackstone's career. Everyone in the ballroom understood the subtext. Jonathan Hartwell wasn't just Emma's uncle, he was also one of Emerald Crown Resort's largest investors. His quarterly technology conferences alone generated millions in revenue for the property. His approval could make careers. His displeasure could end them. Blackstone's face cycled through several shades of red as he realized the trap he had walked into. "Sir, there are protocols about employee interaction with guests, especially minors. Liability concerns, you understand. We have to protect." "Protect whom?" Jonathan interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge that made several people step back involuntarily. "Protect my niece from experiencing a moment of genuine human connection? Protect your guests from witnessing an act of simple kindness? Or protect a system that treats decent people like Mr. Rodriguez as inherently dangerous simply because they work with their hands instead of manipulating stock prices?" Daniel felt his knees go weak. In all his years of working service jobs, no one with real power had ever spoken about him, or people like him, with such respect. The casual reference to his decency, the acknowledgement of his humanity, the recognition that his work had value regardless of how others chose to price it. It was almost overwhelming. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He walked slowly toward Daniel, each step carrying the attention of 300 witnesses. When he stopped, it was close enough to extend his hand in greeting, as if Daniel were a fellow executive rather than a janitor who had just been fired. "Mr. Rodriguez, isn't it?" Jonathan said, offering his hand with the same respect he might show to a fellow CEO. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Jonathan Hartwell, Emma's uncle." Daniel stared at the extended hand for a heartbeat, hardly able to process what was happening. Then, with the same dignity he had brought to everything else that evening, he reached out and grasped Jonathan's hand firmly. "Daniel Rodriguez, sir. It's an honor to meet you." "The honor is entirely mine," Jonathan replied, and the simple statement sent ripples of shock through the observing crowd. "I've had the privilege of watching you work several of my events here at Emerald Crown. Your attention to detail, your respect for the spaces you maintain, your quiet professionalism, they haven't gone unnoticed." Daniel felt tears threatening again. To be seen, truly seen, by someone whose opinion carried such weight in the world. It was a gift he had never thought to hope for. Jonathan turned to address the ballroom at large, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast space. "I've spent the last half hour watching my niece demonstrate more wisdom, courage, and genuine leadership than I've seen from most boardrooms. She recognized something in Mr. Rodriguez that many of you missed, not because it wasn't there, but because you weren't looking for it." He gestured toward Emma, who sat in her wheelchair with tears of relief streaming down her face. Emma didn't ask Mr. Rodriguez to dance because she felt sorry for herself, or because she wanted to cause a scene. She asked because she recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood that dignity isn't bestowed by wealth or position but claimed through character. Rebecca stepped forward, her face a complex mixture of pride in her daughter and shame at her own initial reaction. "Emma, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I should've." "It's okay, Mom," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying a maturity that made several adults look away in embarrassment. "You were scared. People do dumb things when they're scared." The simple forgiveness, offered without conditions or conditions, hit the ballroom like a physical force. Here was a 9-year-old girl who had just watched the adults around her try to destroy someone for being kind to her, and her response was understanding rather than anger. Jonathan nodded approvingly at his niece, then turned his attention back to the authority figures who had been so eager to punish Daniel. "Mr. Blackstone, I believe you owe Mr. Rodriguez an apology, as does Mr. Cross, who seemed remarkably quick to suggest criminal implications where none existed." Alexander Cross, who had been preparing legal strategies to contain the situation, found himself at a complete loss for words. The narrative he had been constructing, dangerous employee, manipulating vulnerable child, had just been demolished by the one person in the ballroom whose opinion could override everyone else's. But it was Daniel who spoke next, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained him through 7 years of single fatherhood and invisible labor. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your support more than you know, but I don't need their apologies." He looked around the ballroom, taking in all the faces that had judged him, dismissed him, or tried to criminalize his kindness. "Emma asked me to dance, and I said yes. That's not something I need to apologize for, and it's not something that requires anyone else's permission." The statement sent another wave of shock through the crowd. Here was a man who had just been publicly fired and threatened with criminal investigation, and instead of groveling for mercy or accepting charity from a powerful ally, he was asserting his own worth with unshakable conviction. Jonathan smiled, the first genuine expression of joy anyone had seen from him all evening. "Mr. Rodriguez, I couldn't agree more. Which is why I'd like to make you an offer." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, but instead of handing it to Daniel immediately, he held it where everyone in the ballroom could see it. Hartwell Quantum is always looking for people who understand that real work, the kind that actually matters, comes in many forms. We need someone to head our facilities management division, someone who understands that maintaining spaces where people can do their best work is just as important as the work itself. The offer hung in the air like a miracle. Daniel stared at the business card, hardly able to process what was being offered. Not just a job, but recognition. Not just employment, but dignity. Not just survival, but the chance to show his daughter that courage could be rewarded, that standing up for what was right could lead to something better. "The salary is commensurate with the importance of the position," Jonathan continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. 6 figures, full benefits, stock options, and a commitment that no one in my company will ever be punished for treating others with basic human respect." Emma clapped her hands together with delight, her joy so pure and infectious that several people found themselves smiling despite the tension that still crackled through the air. But Daniel didn't reach for the card immediately. Instead, he looked down at Emma, the remarkable little girl who had seen something in him worth defending, worth standing up for, worth risking everything to protect. "What do you think, Princess?" he asked quietly. "Should I take the job?" Emma's smile could have lit the entire city of Seattle. "Only if you promise to save me a dance at the company Christmas party." "Deal," Daniel said, reaching out to accept Jonathan Hartwell's business card, and with it, a future he had never dared to imagine. The business card felt impossibly light in Daniel's hand, but its weight in his life was immeasurable. As the immediate shock of Jonathan's offer began to settle, the Aurora Grand Ballroom seemed to exhale collectively, as if 300 people were finally processing what they had just witnessed. But Jonathan Hartwell wasn't finished. He remained standing in the center of the ballroom, his presence commanding continued attention even as guests began to whisper among themselves about the extraordinary turn of events. "Before this evening concludes," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I think it's important that we all understand what actually happened here tonight." He gestured toward Emma, who sat in her wheelchair with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose faith in human nature had been thoroughly vindicated. "My niece didn't just ask a stranger to dance. She identified someone whose character transcended his circumstances, someone whose dignity was invisible to most of you, only because you had been taught not to look for it." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of discomfort throughout the crowd. Several guests shifted nervously, recognizing themselves in Jonathan's gentle but unmistakable criticism. "Emma saw what I've been seeing for months," Jonathan continued, turning to look directly at Daniel. "Mr. Rodriguez, you probably don't realize this, but I've been watching you work my events here for the better part of a year. Not because I was suspicious or concerned, but because I was curious about the man who approached every task, no matter how mundane, with such obvious care and respect." Daniel felt his breath catch. To discover that someone of Jonathan's stature had been observing him, evaluating him, seeing value in work that others dismissed as menial, it was both humbling and validating in ways he was still struggling to process. "I watched you clean spilled wine from priceless carpets with the same attention you gave to polishing brass fixtures that most people never notice," Jonathan said. "I saw you work around sleeping guests in hotel lobbies without ever disturbing their rest. I observed you training new employees with patience and dignity, teaching them that every job, every single job, could be performed with pride." Jonathan's words were painting a picture of Daniel that he had never seen himself, a portrait of a man whose character revealed itself not in grand gestures but in countless small acts of professional integrity and human decency. But more than that, Jonathan continued, his voice growing softer but somehow more powerful, I watched you interact with the other service staff. I saw you cover shifts for colleagues who had sick children. I witnessed you share your lunch with new employees who hadn't received their first paycheck yet. I observed you mediating conflicts between workers with the same fairness and wisdom that most executives never develop. Rebecca stepped closer to her brother, her face reflecting a dawning understanding of something she had missed entirely. Jonathan, what are you saying? I'm saying that tonight wasn't the first time Mr. Rodriguez demonstrated leadership, Jonathan replied. It was simply the first time he did it in front of people who had the power to recognize it properly. The revelation sent a murmur through the ballroom. The narrative that many guests had constructed, successful businessman rescuing worthy janitor, was being reframed as something far more complex and profound. Emma didn't discover Mr. Rodriguez's character tonight, Jonathan explained, his eyes finding his niece's face. She simply had the wisdom to trust what she could see immediately, while the rest of us took months or years to notice what was right in front of us. Emma's cheeks flushed with pride, but her expression remained serious. Uncle Jonathan, I just saw someone who looked lonely, she said simply. And I've been lonely too, so I knew what it looked like. The statement hit the ballroom like a physical blow. Here was a child articulating something that most adults spent lifetimes failing to understand. That recognizing others' pain required first acknowledging your own. That true empathy came not from pity but from shared experience. Jonathan nodded slowly, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Emma, you've just identified something that took me 40 years in business to fully appreciate. The best leaders aren't the ones who have never struggled. They're the ones who remember what struggle feels like and use that memory to recognize excellence wherever it appears. He turned back to address the full ballroom, his voice carrying a new intensity. How many of you have worked with people like Mr. Rodriguez? People whose dedication, integrity, and quiet competence keep your businesses running, your events successful, your lives comfortable? And how many of you have ever really seen them, really acknowledged, that their work requires skill, intelligence, and character? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several guests looked down at their phones or their champagne glasses, unwilling to meet Jonathan's direct gaze. This isn't about charity, Jonathan continued relentlessly. This isn't about feeling good about ourselves by helping the less fortunate. This is about recognizing that we've been so blinded by credentials and social position that we've missed the leadership qualities that were developing right under our noses. He gestured toward the service staff who had emerged from their designated invisibility to watch the evening's events unfold. Look around this room, really look. How many of the people serving your drinks tonight are putting themselves through college? How many are supporting elderly parents or raising children alone? How many have developed skills and wisdom that your companies desperately need if only you were willing to look past their current job titles? Maria Santos, Daniel's former supervisor, stepped forward from her position near the service entrance. Her voice was quiet but clear as she addressed the ballroom. Mr. Rodriguez trained 17 new employees in 3 years. Not one of them quit during their first month, which is almost unheard of in this industry. He taught them not just how to do the work, but how to take pride in it. Her words sparked something in other service staff members, who began sharing their own observations about Daniel's character and leadership. He organized the employee fund that helped Carlos pay for his daughter's surgery, offered a young waiter named Miguel. He's the one who convinced management to provide English classes for the housekeeping staff, added Jennifer, a banquet coordinator. When I was going through my divorce and couldn't afford childcare, he arranged his schedule so he could cover my evening shifts, said Patricia, a veteran server. As the testimonials continued, a fuller picture of Daniel Rodriguez emerged, not just as a conscientious employee, but as an informal leader who had been quietly building community, solving problems, and developing people without any official authority or recognition. Jonathan listened to each testimony with growing satisfaction, as if his point was being proven more thoroughly than he had dared hope. This, he said finally, is what real leadership looks like. Not the kind that comes with corner offices and stock options, but the kind that emerges from character, develops through service, and reveals itself through the trust of colleagues. He looked directly at Daniel, his expression conveying respect that transcended social boundaries. Mr. Rodriguez, the job I offered you isn't charity. It's recognition of abilities you've already demonstrated. The only difference is that now you'll be compensated appropriately for leadership you've been providing for free. Daniel felt a tear slide down his cheek as the full impact of the evening's transformation settled over him. Not just the job offer, not just the financial security, but the recognition that his work had always mattered, that his character had been visible to those who knew how to look for it. But perhaps most importantly, Jonathan concluded, his voice growing gentle as he looked toward Emma, tonight reminded all of us what courage actually looks like. It doesn't always come from boardrooms or podiums. Sometimes it comes from a little girl who refuses to accept that dignity is determined by circumstance, and a man who chooses to dance even when the world tells him he should remain invisible. Emma reached out and took Daniel's free hand, the gesture simple but profound in its symbolism. Two people who had found each other across every barrier that society had constructed between them, united by their shared understanding that worth wasn't something you earned through others' approval, but something you claimed through your own actions. "Thank you, Uncle Jonathan," Emma said quietly, "but I think Daniel and I already knew all of this. We just needed everyone else to catch up." The statement, delivered with a 9-year-old's matter-of-fact wisdom, captured the essential truth of the entire evening. The revelation hadn't been about discovering hidden qualities in Daniel or unexpected depths in Emma. It had been about forcing a room full of successful, influential people to confront their own blindness, their own assumptions, their own failure to see what had been right in front of them all along. In the silence that followed Emma's words, Jonathan Hartwell smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just witnessed his favorite niece deliver a masterclass in cutting straight to the heart of what mattered most. 6 months later, Daniel Rodriguez stood in his corner office on the 32nd floor of the Hartwell Quantum Building, watching the Seattle skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that still took his breath away. The view stretched from Elliott Bay to the Cascade Mountains, a panorama that reminded him daily of how dramatically his world had expanded since that transformative evening at the Aurora Grand Ballroom. But it wasn't the office that had changed him most profoundly. It wasn't even the salary that had allowed him to move Lily into a beautiful apartment with her own room and a view of the Sound. It was the letter he held in his hands, creased from multiple readings, that captured the true magnitude of what had begun with a simple invitation to dance. The letter was from Emma, written in her careful 9-year-old handwriting, and it had arrived that morning along with a photograph that made his chest tight with pride and joy. "Dear Daniel, I hope you liked the picture from our school's father-daughter dance. As you can see, I brought Uncle Jonathan, but I told everyone about my other dancing partner, the one who taught me that courage isn't about not being scared, it's about dancing anyway. I wanted you to know that 3 girls from my class asked their janitors to dance at the school event. They said I inspired them, but I told them the truth. You inspired me first. Mrs. Patterson says this is what she calls a ripple effect. I like that phrase. It makes me think about how one brave choice can spread out like rings on water, touching people you'll never even meet. Mom says I can visit your office next week when I come for my appointment at Seattle Children's Hospital. I promise I won't ask you to dance in the lobby, though I might if they have good music playing. Your friend always, Emma. P.S. Lily is the luckiest girl in the world to have you as her daddy. I hope you know that." Daniel set the letter down on his desk, not the metal utilitarian surface he had worked at for 3 years at Emerald Crown, but a rich mahogany workspace that came with the respect Jonathan had insisted he deserved. Beside the letter sat the photograph Emma had mentioned, a radiant little girl in a lavender dress, spinning in her wheelchair while her Uncle Jonathan knelt beside her, both of them laughing with pure joy. But it was what was happening in the background of the photo that had brought tears to Daniel's eyes when he first saw it. 3 other father-daughter pairs were dancing, and in each case the men wore the navy uniforms of maintenance and janitorial staff. They moved with the same careful grace Daniel remembered from his own dance with Emma, their faces glowing with the pride that came from being seen as worthy partners by their own daughters. A soft knock on his office door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," Daniel called, turning to see Jonathan Hartwell standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression of quiet satisfaction. "I thought you might need some caffeine before the board meeting," Jonathan said, setting 1 cup on Daniel's desk. "Though I suspect you're more prepared than half the executives who've been doing this for decades." Daniel smiled, accepting the coffee with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over 6 months of working together. Jonathan's prediction about his abilities had proven prophetic. Daniel's approach to facilities management had revolutionized how Hartwell Quantum thought about workplace environment and employee satisfaction. "I've been reading Emma's letter," Daniel said, gesturing to the creased paper. "Did you know about the school dance?" Jonathan's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Emma insisted on showing me the pictures. She was particularly proud that she had, quote, started a movement, as she put it. Though I think she was more excited about proving that her judgment of character was better than most adults." "She was right about that," Daniel acknowledged. "About a lot of things, actually." Through the window, Daniel could see the Emerald Crown Resort in the distance, its elegant facade unchanged, despite all the transformation that had occurred in the months since the Pinnacle Foundation Gala. Thomas Blackstone had been quietly transferred to a different property after what corporate euphemistically called a review of management practices. Alexander Cross had found his services no longer required by several high-profile clients who had been present that evening. But the most significant changes had been less visible and more profound. Daniel had restructured Hartwell Quantum's entire approach to facilities and employee services, implementing programs that recognize the intelligence and potential of every worker regardless of their current job title. The company now offered education reimbursement for custodial staff, promoted maintenance workers into supervisory roles based on leadership qualities rather than credentials, and had established what they called pathway programs that allowed employees to transition between departments based on demonstrated ability rather than formal qualifications. The results had exceeded even Jonathan's optimistic projections. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, turnover had dropped to nearly zero, and productivity had increased as workers who felt valued and seen began contributing ideas and innovations that had previously gone unrecognized. "The Seattle Times wants to do a feature story about our workplace culture initiatives," Jonathan mentioned, settling into the chair across from Daniel's desk. "They're particularly interested in the Dignity at Work program you developed." Daniel felt a familiar flutter of discomfort at the attention. 6 months of success hadn't entirely erased years of learned invisibility. "I hope they focus on the program rather than making it about personal stories." "Actually," Jonathan said with a slight smile, "I think they should make it about personal stories. About yours, about Emma's, about the dozens of employees whose careers have been transformed because someone finally recognized their potential." He leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "Daniel, you need to understand something. What happened that night at the gala wasn't just about you getting a better job, or Emma making a friend. It was about proving that our entire system for recognizing leadership and potential is fundamentally flawed." Jonathan gestured toward the letter from Emma. "Those fathers who danced with their daughters at the school event? They went home and told their wives about feeling respected, valued, seen. Their children watched them stand taller, speak with more confidence, approach their work with renewed pride. That's not just a ripple effect, that's social change." Daniel nodded slowly, beginning to understand the broader implications of what had begun as a simple moment of human connection. "Emma keeps talking about invisible people in her letters. She says she wants to make sure everyone gets seen. She's 9 years old, and she's already a better social theorist than most graduate students," Jonathan observed with obvious pride. "But more than that, she's proven that wisdom doesn't require credentials, that insight can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the people society overlooks are the ones with the clearest vision of what needs to change." A gentle chime from Daniel's computer indicated his next appointment was waiting. Maria Santos, his former supervisor, had requested a meeting to discuss expanding the Pathway program to other hospitality companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. Her transformation from overworked facilities supervisor to regional coordinator for employee development had been one of the most satisfying outcomes of the past 6 months. "I should let you prepare for your meeting," Jonathan said, rising from his chair. "But Daniel, I want you to know something. When I offered you this job, I thought I was giving you an opportunity. I realize now that you were giving one to me, the chance to build a company that actually reflects the values I claim to believe in." After Jonathan left, Daniel stood again at his window, looking out over the city that had become a different place for him entirely. Somewhere out there, Lily was in her new school, telling her friends about her daddy's important job with the confidence of a child who had watched her father's worth be recognized and celebrated. Somewhere out there, Emma was probably planning her next act of revolutionary kindness, her next challenge to the assumptions that kept people in boxes they had never chosen for themselves. And somewhere out there, in countless workplaces and schools and community centers, people who had learned to make themselves invisible were beginning to remember that they had always deserved to be seen. Daniel picked up Emma's letter one more time, focusing on her postscript about Lily being the luckiest girl in the world. The assessment wasn't quite accurate, he realized with a smile that felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. The luckiest man in the world was the one who had learned to dance again, who had remembered that dignity was something you claimed rather than something you earned, and who had discovered that sometimes the most profound revolutions began with a simple question: "May I have this dance?" In 2 hours, he would present his quarterly report to Hartwell Quantum's board of directors, outlining programs that had transformed dozens of lives and fundamentally altered how one of Seattle's most successful companies thought about human potential. But first he was going to call his daughter and ask her about her day, listening with the full attention of a father who understood that the most important conversations often happened between people who had learned to really see each other. And tonight, like every night since that transformative evening 6 months ago, he would fall asleep grateful for a 9-year-old girl's wisdom, a billionaire's recognition, and the music that had taught him to dance again, not just with his feet but with his entire life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.